Hey everybody, Bobby back for another video, and I hope to talk in depth today about the various ways we connect our brewery together, whether it be sort of a simple one kettle system with a drain valve, or up to a 3-vessel system with a lot of different pumps and chillers and other accessories. There's always going to be a need to connect things together, whether it be the tubing or the plumbing in general, or just hanging accessories off of the outside of the kettle, or even the accessories that install on the inside. There are sort of permanent ways of, or semi-permanent ways of installing things. There are easily disconnectable or make-break connection type systems out there. And I want to show you a lot of the different popular examples and give you an idea of what the investment is to do certain ones and what I think is the best or worst of the bunch. A lot of this is going to depend on what kind of system you're actually trying to put together and whether you're emulating a commercial brew house or if you're trying to keep it inexpensive. A lot of those factors play into the decision, and going into your initial build with as much information as possible means that you're not going to be rebuying a bunch of things down the line when you realize that you've made a mistake, that perhaps you went in a direction that doesn't scale very well, so you'll end up reselling or binning a bunch of things that you've wasted your money on. So hopefully this is going to be, a wide topic that will give you a better understanding of all of the hardware out there that you have available. Let's talk about some of the most basic connections in the brewery before we get into the more advanced and expensive options. Let's first talk about NPT, or National Pipe Thread. National Pipe Taper is another name for this. This is your basic threaded fitting. A lot of breweries have this type of connection on them, whether it be a coupling welded in or a nipple to couple the coupling to a ball valve, or there's all sorts of different uses for these types of threads. Now, there are a few things that you probably need to know before you can work with these. One is that they are sized in a peculiar way. This happens to be 1/2-inch male NPT thread. They are tapered, so it's a little bit more narrow at the front, and it gets wider as you go further in. It's nowhere near actual 1/2-inch. These are named for their nominal interior dimension, but even that's not quite intuitive because the interior of this nipple is about 5/8 of an inch, even though it's 1/2-inch NPT. The external diameter is actually like 13/16, which is much larger than 1/2-inch. You just have to know the sizes to expect. You can look at a chart online to see what the actual OD of these threads are compared to its name. So this is 1/2-inch NPT, which is a very common size for accessories on a homebrew kettle, for example, and pumps usually have 1/2-inch NPT on them. Now, the male and the female portion of them are both tapered so that as they thread together, they get closer and closer to meshing between the two threads. And that's actually where the seal occurs, is the meshing between threads. When you get to very hard metals like stainless steel, the threads are not able to deform enough to create a seal on their own, so that's why you use things like Teflon tape or PTFE liquid sealant, and it both lubricates the threads to prevent galling and also provides a seal for those little microscopic imperfections between the threads. Common misconception with NPT is that the fittings will thread all the way together so that the male threads of the fitting will disappear completely. That's not the case. The standard really says that there should be a certain amount of thread engagement before the tapers kind of mesh together. And because a lot of these fittings are manufactured in China, you're going to see variations between some fittings. There will be much more penetration before meshing. And sometimes you're only going to get a couple turns, but the important thing is that you get a seal with the appropriate amount of Teflon tape. So that is a thread sealing standard. Also, I want to mention that this is a continuous thread nipple, also 1/2-inch in nominal dimension, but this is called NPS, National Pipe Straight. Basically, once it starts, it does not change in diameter all the way across. You can take a lock nut and thread this completely on all the way across until it falls off the other side. What that means, though, is that it's not necessarily cross-compatible with NPT, but depending on how they size the diameter of this overall, a lot of times you'll get pretty good meshing between NPS and NPT. A lot of times with nipples like this, one side will thread on almost completely into the female side, and then the other side doesn't really have the same amount of success. Like in this case, I was only get a half a turn. You may be able to get that to seal, but it's probably not ideal. Not all NPS and NPT is cross-compatible. You have to kind of try them, trial and error. This one just happens to work out pretty nicely. But in any case, both of the NPS and NPT are, thread sealing standards, unless this is used for a compression gasket, which is pretty common as well. And the last thing about NPT is that you want to be careful with the thread direction. Because the threads are tapered, they only work in one direction. That's a full coupling, so it means it's tapered in both directions. You can thread something in on both sides. So you would weld this into a kettle halfway to have both interior and external ports. Or in the case of like a thermometer port, you might find only a half coupling, which means it's exactly half of a coupling, so it's only accessible in one direction. There's no way of threading in from the backside. So just be careful if you're going to have a bunch of things welded into your kettle. If you want to be able to go on the inside as well, don't use half couplings. Now, another commonly used connection type in homebrewing is the flare connection. Now, it's not so much on the hot side, but it is pretty common in kegging for both liquid and gas connections. The flare standard is a face sealing standard. They don't thread. Now, the way that flare works is that one half of the connection is a male cone and the other side is a female cone. So when they come together, it has a pretty nice tight mesh. The machining is pretty clean. It has to be smooth. And when these are squeezed together tight enough, it creates a seal. Now, what squeezes them together is a combination of the flare nut and the threaded side of the male flare fitting, and these thread together, and when wrenched nice and tight, those cones get squeezed together. Now, when this is a brass fitting on both sides, usually just wrench tightening these will deform the metal enough in the cone that it creates a tight seal. But because stainless steel is so hard, you tend to use this gasket. You can either put like an O-ring in there for a low pressure seal, or these nylon washers, and that performs that deformation that will create the seal. I see a lot of people using Teflon tape or other thread sealants on these threads here, but it's really just because of a misunderstanding of how the seal works. It is only the squeezing together of these cones. In fact, putting Teflon tape on here is counterproductive. It can sometimes make it so the nut doesn't fully seat and it will not pull these together tight enough. If you have a leak, it's either too loose, there's damage on the cone, or you're not using a gasket when you're using stainless. Now let's move on to what's called a compression fitting. This one is actually called a compression adapter because we have compression on one side and male NPT threads on the other. So this is adapting from tubing to NPT threads. But there are other applications like tube compression to tube compression, two different sizes, the same size. We have compression to male Camlock, for instance. But I want to talk mostly about how the tube gets sealed into this end of the fitting. This is called the compression nut, and this is the compression fitting. And they are all sized based on the type of tube OD that will be compressed in here. So the compression nut goes on the tube, and then we have to put a ferrule in here. This ferrule is actually what squeezes against the tube to provide the seal. And it comes in two different flavors. One is a nylon, which is easy to compress, and the other is metal. So in the case of brass fittings, these will be brass as well, but this is a stainless compression fitting, so these are stainless steel ferrules. Because they're so hard, they have to come in a two-piece design. It goes skinny one first, and then the larger one, and both of these cone shapes face the compression fitting. There's a female cone in here, and when this gets all squeezed together, it will swage or compress this ring right onto the tubing and become permanently attached. So it all threads together, and you have to tighten this extremely tight with a pair of large wrenches, and it will actually lock the tubing in. You can see right now that hand tight is nowhere near enough to lock in on this piece of tubing. So for permanent high strength connections, you really want to use the stainless ones. But for most applications, like 90% of brewing applications, I like to use the nylon ferrule, and that is also cone shaped facing the fitting. And when you almost just hand tight is enough to kind of hold that in place. Let's talk about threaded to hose adapter. So this is a 1/2-inch male NPT to hose adapter, or it's commonly called a hose barb. And these thread into your accessories like drain valves or pumps or any other accessory for that matter, and converts it into a fitting that a hose can be pushed onto. This is a 5/8 OD hose barb where I just pushed a 1/2-inch ID hose onto. It's a firm fit because you won't have to use a hose clamp in this situation, and it also maintains maximum flow rather than going down to a very constrictive barb. And you can go ahead and use this hose on here for draining this kettle, and when you're done with your brew day and you want to clean up, you kind of just wiggle this thing back off. Now, it's called the hose barb because there are a bunch of like barbed edges on here to prevent the hose from flying off under pressure, but it also makes it rather difficult to pull the hose off over and over again. And those sharp ridges will eventually kind of, start damaging the hose. You'll just have to keep cutting the damaged end off and keep pushing it on in a new fresh piece. Not a big deal. Very low cost. This, even in stainless steel, is $4 basically. So for every place you need to put a hose, it costs $4 to add the hose barb, but that's really the only way. It's the bare minimum really to hang a hose off of here. What this won't do is adapt to other fittings. I mean, this is only for hoses. There's not much flexibility there. In simple systems, that's all you need. As your system becomes more complex, this becomes more unrealistic as you have more and more hoses to disconnect and such. So that's where you really want to move into a more of a disconnectable type of accessory. So moving on, I want to show you the next most convenient option. This is called the Cool Touch. These are called Cool Touch connectors. They're Cool Touch because the part that you operate with your hand is coated with silicone, so it doesn't get as hot as the rest of the fitting. And it requires that you put a threaded nipple into your accessory, or it has to have a male threaded port on it already. And then this acts just like a garden hose connector. It's got a face sealing O-ring that's silicone on the inside. And you just thread this on just like a garden hose until it bottoms out and that gasket meets the face of that nipple. And it's not that expensive. So the hex nipple, if you need it, is about $3. And then the Cool Touch fitting with the straight barb on the back is about $9. So about $12 or $13 for each disconnectable point. So that's not too expensive. It makes for, pretty simple connections. You're used to using a garden hose, so there's not a whole lot of learning curve there. They come in a couple different configurations. This happens to be a 90-degree version so that the hose kind of drops straight down for you. We also have 5/8 barbs, which is a industry first, is for extreme high flow situations. The large barb with 5/8 OD is really preferable to these smaller ones. Other than that, you know, they do take a little bit longer to make and break the connections because you have to turn them about 3 or 4 full turns before the gasket seats. But other than that, it's a nice intermediate option for making and breaking hose connections. So no video like this would be complete without revisiting my old favorite cam and groove or Camlock fittings. I'm pretty much a Camlock fanboy at this point, but it's for good reason. This type of connection is extremely robust. It's stainless steel and silicone with very few moving parts. The way this works, in case you haven't seen another video of mine, you have a male part that has a lot of different configurations. This one just happens to have male threads on it to thread into the ball valve here. And then you've got your hose connection piece of it, or any other accessory for that matter. Both the male and female portions have threaded male, female, or hose barb versions on the other side. And we've been coming up with a lot of other different configurations, whether it be cam to flare or any other type of connection. The two halves go together like that, and you pull the arms back to engage the squeezing pressure on the gasket. Now that's leak free, and disconnecting is just as easy. It's very, I mean, this qualifies as a quick disconnect by every sense of the word. Still, the reason I like these the most is that they're extremely high flow when you use the proper versions of these fittings for feeding the inlets of pumps that are very demanding for flow. And really the bottom line is that they're the best value in the disconnect space. So this male Cam F here, and if you did the Big C straight hose barb version, is still under $12 for the set. So, you know, for systems that rely on a lot of different make and break points between the hoses and pumps and chillers and recirculation arms and whirlpool and all that, they do get expensive when you outfit an entire system, but comparative to all the other options, the Camlocks still win in value. Also, they do have a lot of flexibility. Like in the case of the Cool Touch that we talked about, you know, this really only is a substitute for adding hoses to accessories, but other disconnects like the Camlocks are not just for hoses. Because they come in so many different configurations, both on the male and female portion. Things like, you know, this is our Tops Flow DC pump, which I'm a huge fan of. It's such a lightweight pump that once you put a disconnect on here, instead of having a hose that goes between your accessory and the pump, you just put the pump right on there. And that's robust enough to support the weight easily. You know, once you lock these down, it's pretty secure. You can rotate this in the, like, let's say the upward position, and then relock it in place like that, and that holds it in place like that. So, you know, if the accessory is not overly heavy and going to burden the gasket or anything, you can hang, you know, accessories right off of the ports. So that's something that the like the Cool Touch and hose barbs obviously cannot do when you expand your system. All right, let's talk about ball lock quick disconnects. Now, when I use that terminology, unfortunately, people are used to calling these ball lock quick disconnects, and the term ball lock seems to be already commandeered by the soda keg industry or the kegging industry. But it is true, these are ball lock quick disconnects. So you notice when you pull this sleeve back, there's a bunch of ball bearings that start floating around freely in there. And when you let go, the ball bearings kind of push into this bore. And those are locking the ball bearings onto a groove on the connector. So that is true. That is called a ball lock quick disconnect, but so is this. This connector here has the same sleeve with ball bearings that are captured in there. And then when they go on this and you let go, those are locked together because of the ball bearings. So these are ball lock quick disconnects as well. Now, this type of QD, quick disconnect, has been around for quite some time. They very closely mimic the connectors for pneumatics, air compressor tools and such. You know, unfortunately, every single profile on the male and female part is completely dependent on each other, meaning there's no universal standard for this type of quick disconnect. They're not necessarily cross-vendor compatible, and there are only a few vendors, pairs or sets of vendors in the US that will have the same exact product. So you have to really look at the pictures really carefully of what these knurls look like and whether this has a hex on it or if it's smooth. So, I just advise you, if you like this type of disconnect, that you really should be buying from the same vendor to be sure, or at least buy one fitting to test for compatibility with whatever fittings you may already have. Now, these are very similar to the Camlocks in how flexible they are and how many different ways you can connect hoses and accessories together with them. In fact, the form factor is so similar that we've actually named these the same as all of the Camlocks. So whereas this is called a Camlock type F, this is called a BLQD type F. It does about the same thing. It's got male threads on one side and a male quick disconnect nipple on the other. And I also call these the C type BLQD, just like the C Camlock. One thing we do differently is that we're the only vendor currently that offers these with super high flow barbs on them, just like our Camlocks. That's a 5/8 barb. And really, for feeding things like chugger pumps, you cannot really go wrong with using something with a nice wide hose barb on there. Again, these are just as flexible as the Camlocks. The slight negative side to the actual physical mechanics of this thing is that the ball bearings have to be pretty free floating in here to make it easy to engage the connector. They can tend to foul up if there's some sticky wort in the ball bearings. You have to be pretty careful about cleaning these after every use to make sure that these don't get sticky or fail in any way. Just the ease of the disconnect is compromised when they get dirty. Let's just put it that way. They also have silicone O-rings as the seal. There's not quite as much seal surface as the Camlock, so if that O-ring gets a nick in it or wears out a little bit, that seal surface right there is relatively minimal compared to the Camlock face sealing. But as long as you keep the gaskets in good shape or replace them on a regular basis, you shouldn't have a problem. These sure are pretty, and the make and break operation is, for the most part, a one-handed operation. If you can get pretty good at operating these. You pull back on the sleeve, you engage it, and then you let go. So that's one hand, and then also pulling on the sleeve to disconnect is a one-hand operation. Whereas the Camlocks are more like both hands, because pulling back the cam arms at the same time makes it a lot easier. Okay, so why wouldn't everybody go with these if they're so nice? Well, the other downside, besides that sticky issue if you don't clean them regularly, is the cost. The Type F BLQD and this is called the C+. This pair right here is about $21 for this set. Compared to the Camlocks at $12 a disconnect set, or less, $11.50 basically, these are almost twice as expensive as the Camlock option. Let's talk about Triclover or TC or Triclamp or Sanitary fittings. There's a lot of different names for these. But this is a series of connections that are made by sandwiching a gasket of some type. This happens to be a silicone gasket between two like flanges, okay? And then the clamp goes over this to squeeze them together tight. It's both a leak-free connection as well as a nice mechanical rigid connection. So if you've got a bunch of heavy accessories to hang off of something, this provides a very strong mechanical connection as well that'll support the weight. And the other thing it has going for it is the fact that it's always just a like-to-like connection. There's no male and female. So you have a lot of connectivity flexibility between several different accessories. The reason why you find these connections in a lot of commercial breweries, or I should say commercial brewers use these exclusively for making their connections, because once the connection is completely taken apart, there is a very smooth surface and it leads to ease in cleaning, and then you can prove that there's no places for bacteria to multiply or get caught. So aside from those advantages, this type of connection, at least on the homebrew scale, is somewhat impractical. Now, that doesn't stop people from investing a ton of money into doing this on a small homebrew scale, but first of all of that sanitary talk about the smoothness and everything is completely negated if you end up integrating threaded connections into the same system. So this is a threaded adapter. This happens to be an 1.5" TC flange to male 1/2" NPT. And I see this pretty often where someone will buy a cheaper ball valve and then hang it off of their Triclamp or TC ferrules on their pots. So just as an example, you'd put this on the pot and you're back to regular threaded accessories again. I'll just say right now that if you think that the sanitary nature of the Triclamp system is one of the reasons why you might adopt it, you cannot go to threaded adapters and threaded fittings, or anything threaded for that matter, and still maintain that advantage. Now, if you just want to make your system look like a miniature version of a pro brew system, and you don't care what it costs, then I guess I can accept that. But the other disadvantage of this type of connection system is that it's not really a quick disconnect by any means. People who work in breweries get really good at manipulating the clamps and gaskets for these, but just to give you an idea, part of the problem is that you've got these heavy accessories that you need to attach. You have to hold the gasket in place and then sandwich it all together. Now, one hand is holding the accessory in place, and you've got to learn to flip the clamp around like that, then kind of pinch it all together, swing the locking nut into place, and then tighten it. Now, unless you do this every day, it's kind of an awkward type of thing, and every time you take these apart, the gasket usually falls out and rolls around on the floor, which you then have to clean. So it's not the most user-friendly, convenient way of making and breaking connections. And then I'll just finally say that the cost is a pretty significant factor. The other issue is just the overall bulk. So if you have the need to put something like a T, let's say you need a temperature probe accessory in a side of a T, the T's and elbows are very bulky for the TC standard. And again, if you have to go to threads to be able to use a compact T, again, you're totally negating the utility of the sanitary fitting. So accessories that come off of your kettle may only be 13 inches wide, but the accessories that are Triclover based might be hanging 17 inches off the side of the kettle. It looks obnoxious and it's totally unnecessary. The other issue with Triclamp is just the lack of flexibility on the interior. And what I mean by that is that, like, on the interior of your pot, if you've got these ferrules welded in, you've got this open hole here, which is about 1 3/8 inches. So on the outside, you can attach a valve, like an easy clean valve, for example, and that's not a big deal because they're just TC to TC, but people don't think ahead about dip tubes and whirlpools and sparge arms and things like that, and they just have this wide open hole in the side of the kettle. There's all kind of welding stuff you can do, of course, but we've created products that add the ability to add interior accessories. Like, this is a double-sided adapter, so you have female threads on both sides. So when you pop this in from the outside, you now have female threads on the inside that you can access for other accessories. So that's a custom piece that adds cost. The other thing we've done is made like the Easy Clean valve that has an integrated brazed dip tube in here. So you thread this in, you put your clamp on, and now you've got an integrated dip tube that you can position however you want. Again, another added cost. And then finally, we have this press fit dip tube. So if you've already got a valve that you like and you've got this hole on the inside of the kettle, but you still want to add like a whirlpool or a dip tube, we have this assembly that the press fit portion of it means that you just kind of like wiggle it and get the gaskets to seat inside there. And then that's a nice tight seal, and you can kind of turn this and position it however you want to get off the bottom. Now, that's all very clever, and it solves problems that people find themselves in, but you have to understand that these are added costs to the overall system that you really probably didn't anticipate when you were first purchasing that kettle and, you know, dreaming of all the TC ports that you want to hang off the side of it. You know, not to mention Herms coils and all these other things that you might want to hang off of this kettle. It's so much more expensive to do it with TC standard rather than a threaded or compression type version of the same. So even a very simple thing, I'll give you a perfect example of the costs involved here. Just to do a threaded adapter, let's say that this was hanging off of your pot and you want to make a hose connection with the TC standard. It looks like this type of connection here will cost you about $34 to do. And that happens to be the most expensive way of adapting a hose to a threaded port on a valve. $34 just to do that. Now, if you think of all the different connections that have to be made over the long haul amongst all these different kettles and accessories, this is going to cost you several $100s just to make a few hose connections. The one place that it makes a lot of sense to use this standard is for the install of heating elements, because the wide open port makes a lot of sense. It's actually a necessity. And then the other application where I really like TC or sanitary fittings is on conical fermenters and any other fermentation vessel for that matter, because that's where the sanitary nature of these types of fittings is very important. So, you know, I'm not completely anti-Triclamp, of course, but on the homebrew scale, I think every other choice is probably a better choice for this type of thing. In summary, I think the sweet spot is really in the Camlock or the BLQD series of disconnects. They're not too far off in price points. If you're budget minded, I think the cams are definitely the winner. If you just want the nicest possible quick disconnect, then the BLQDs would be my choice. If you think I missed anything or you have any further comments or questions, please leave a comment on this video and I'll get right back to you. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See ya.